Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Heritage Talks Online. I'm your host, Dwayne Wilkin, and I'm here with Alison Kirkwood to introduce today's guest speaker, the historian, Lorne Huston. Now, I have to admit, when Lorne first proposed this idea for a talk, I was a little bit hesitant. Thinking and speaking about culture, even in a narrowly defined artistic sense, seems very fraught these days. For one thing, arts and culture so deeply permeate our everyday lives that to consider them in isolation is a bit like putting air under a microscope. But it's easy to forget our world is as much the legacy of artistic vision and achievement of the past as it is a product of science and technology. Second, outside the world of professional artists and dealers and collectors, the term culture has come to denote all kinds of human occupations and identities. Culture is not just artistic, but it's also scientific and intellectual. It's professional and literary and mainstream and alternative and linguistic and historical and so on. The range of meaning only limited by the number of adjectives that we can fix in front of the noun. And of course, culture always raises political questions. What good is it? Who does it serve? Why does it matter? How do we pay for it? No wonder the phrase culture wars has become kind of a ubiquitous shorthand for those debates on everything from climate change and human rights and healthcare and democracy and cultural policy itself. Arts and culture had a far smaller canvas to cover in mid-19th century Montreal, however, with its busy new factories and its booming population. For a few of the city's British elite, culture implied, at most, some knowledge of, if not a taste for, European fine art. So how did a relatively small group of ambitious colonial businessmen from an outpost of the British Empire play such a key role nurturing and developing Quebec's art world prior to the 20th century? Before Lorne tackles this question, let me take a moment to thank our major donors who have made the Heritage Talk series possible this winter: the Department of Canadian Heritage, the Zeller Family Foundation, and Townshippers Foundation. The Quebec Anglophone Heritage Network also receives support from our member organizations across the province. And we are grateful to the hundreds of people who support us through subscriptions to our quarterly magazine, Quebec Heritage News. A special thanks to all of you who are watching us today. You can find more information about Quan and the work we do on our website at www.qahn.org. And please consider joining as a paid member to ensure that we can continue to bring you Heritage Talks, as well as workshops, conferences, exhibits, and special events. Today is a great day to join because Quan is offering first-time members 30% off the usual price of a one-year subscription. That's just $20 for 4 issues of Quebec Heritage News. Please message Allison in the Zoom chat box or by Facebook Messenger to claim this offer, valid only until the end of today's presentation. A final word about technology. If you're joining us by Zoom, I'll ask you to please switch your webcam off during Lorne's presentation, but please do turn your camera back on during question and answer period. To speak your questions and comments aloud, just click on that yellow raise hand icon in the reactions box at the bottom of your screen to get my attention. You can also type questions and comments directly into the Zoom chat box or on Facebook Messenger. We've talked quite a bit in this series about people and events from the past and how these stories contribute to our understanding of Quebec history. Today, we turn our attention to the story behind one of Canada's oldest and most iconic cultural spaces, the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts. The museum's forerunner, the Art Association of Montreal, was formed in 1860 by a group of wealthy merchants professing a variety of motivations, but who shared an interest in promoting the city's cultural reputation by organizing regular art shows. In doing so, they helped lay the groundwork for future art education and the emergence of a truly modern and Canadian arts scene. Our guide to this period is a retired history professor from Cégep Édouard Montpetit in Longueuil, whose specialty is the history of Quebec's English-speaking arts sector. In addition to the Art Association of Montreal, he has studied and written about Montreal's English language theater scene and on art and drama criticism in the city between 1900 and 1950. His recent publications include George M. Brewer et le milieu culturel anglophone montréalais 1900 à 1950, which he co-authored with the musicologist Marie-Thérèse Lefebvre. Lorne Huston, welcome to Heritage Talks Online.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Dwayne. And thank you to Kwan for providing this forum. I'm really looking forward to the exchanges, and it certainly has been a very stimulating exercise for me to pull this presentation together. I must admit, you've scared me a little bit with the fraught questions that you mentioned in your out at the outset there. I'm not really going to be dealing with many questions like that. I just, for me, I really feel that the Art Association in itself was a heritage that I could identify with. And I just wanted to understand how it happened. And so in a way, I'm certainly willing to discuss questions like what you raised at the end. But for me, I just went for it for the fun of it, to try and understand how it worked. So basically, today what I want to do is to examine 6 art exhibitions that the Art Association of Montreal organized during the period 1864 to 1872. Now, actually, the Art Association was set up in 1860, and there were a couple of exhibitions that were held at that time in 1860 around the idea of opening the Victoria Bridge. The Prince of Wales was to be present for the occasion. We had created the new Crystal Palace, and Rod McLeod spoke about that a few months ago. And but those exhibitions were more around a specific event. And what I was more interested in is the dynamics of the situation. And it was really in 1864 that the Art Association really decided to try and organize a series of annual exhibitions. And I think the idea of annual exhibitions is really important, because it's one thing to have an exhibition at one time, but once you have an institution that is organizing these things on a constant basis, then other dynamics start to enter in to the organization of the events. And so I wanted to look at those. So I said 1864 to 1872. I'd say that the work that I'm going to be presenting today is based on 3 series of contemporary documents. That there are the catalogs of the exhibitions. Fortunately, they have all been conserved. They're all digitized, I think is the word. And the minutes of the council meetings, that has been digitized by the museum, Montreal Museum of Fine Arts. And I really plowed through those, trying to understand some of the discussions that were going there. And then there are the scrapbooks that have also been kept by the Art Association and are in the archives, but have also been digitized by the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts. So there's been some very precious archival work that was done to make this possible. I should say too that I have checked all of these sources have tiny faults. We know that the catalogs aren't exact. We know that sometimes the minutes that were reconstructed from newspaper accounts and everything like that, but they're pretty good, and we can discuss any little problems if people are interested. And in terms of secondary sources, I'd say there's 2 sources in particular that I found very useful, and if people are interested, I'll be willing to talk about them a little bit more. One is Jean Trudel himself, who was a director of the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts. And the other is by a fellow that was a doctoral student at the University of Laval, Marc Gauthier, who worked on a history of the Art Association, never really pulled it into a final thesis form, but did put all his work and his research up on the web. And I've worked with him a little bit to discuss different things, and he was very generous. And anybody can see this information. but it really encouraged me to tackle this subject. Okay, so how am I going to do this? I'd like to basically do three parts. One is to talk about the exhibitions themselves, just describe them. What would people be seeing if they went to one of these exhibitions? The second is to look at what I call the players, because there are the artists, of course. There are there's the public. But apart from that, there are the organizers of these things. So they set the rules, set the dates, set the conditions, so on. And there are the lenders, because most of these art exhibitions consisted mainly of works that were lent by private collectors for the period of the exhibition, so that would last a week or so. So the lenders, and there are dealers involved. And there are some community leaders, if you like, that are also involved that I'll be talking about. So the second idea, the exhibitions, first idea, the exhibitions, second idea, the players, and the third idea, third part is what I call the dynamics of the situation. How did these people interact? How did it evolve over time? So let me see here, just get this straight. We'll start perhaps with I'll just give you a kind of a quick overview of the exhibitions, because what's interesting is this was a work in progress. These exhibitions, there'd been nothing like this that had been done before. There had been specific exhibitions that had been organized by an artist or by an association at one point, but they were punctual, specific events, and there was no idea of the idea of making them regular and permanent. I seem to be missing a little something here, but what I'll do is I'll just share the screen, if you don't mind. We'll look at. Okay, and I'll just go quickly through. Here, we'll get this up here. I'll just go quickly through the 6 exhibitions, giving a few details on how they differed from each other. Because, like I started to say, they are. It was a work in progress, and they were trying different types of exhibitions to see what would interest people more, who would cooperate in what way, and so on. So just take a look at these. At the same time, we can talk a little bit about the relations with the people. So there were these exhibitions, 1864. We see the dealers are blue, the painters are orange, and the patrons, what I call the patrons. So there's 3 types of lenders, if you like, at each of these exhibitions. There are the lenders themselves, whom I'm going to call patrons. It's not necessarily the best word. I don't know if there's a better word. Not all of them were really art patrons, but they were contributing because they had artworks, but that was not their main function in life. They were not related to the art to the art world as in any professional way. And then there were the painters who took advantage of the idea of lending their works. They said, oh, well, I know somebody that has a collection of works that is willing to lend a painting, and it happens to be my own. And so they would lend some of their own paintings, and that way they would have a certain amount of visibility for their work. And then there were some dealers that there should be more research done on some of these dealers that weren't necessarily that they might represent artists, they might own the artists, they might be on consignment from the artists. Sometimes they might be even representing collectors that didn't want necessarily their names to be associated with the paintings there. So these are the 3 types, and we see how, in general, the patrons dominate until this 1872 exhibition, and we'll talk about that. But it was mainly private individuals that loaned some of their works. What were they loaning? On the whole, it was oil paintings. We can see it varied a little bit as time went on. Watercolors, roughly on a 50-50 basis. Sorry. And we see, and then the gray is the others. So these could be photographs at times. They could be statues. They could like sculptures. They could be, and there were at times we'll see there were other types of artwork that was shown as well. 1865, you can see, was a big occasion for that. That also, these figures here just give you a general outlook on how many works were shown at each time. So the 1865 was a special exhibition in that sense. Otherwise, it tended to turn roughly around 200 works of art that were shown at each of the exhibitions. And I tried to, where did these the artists come from that whose works were being shown? So we have to remember that there are some artists that are showing their own work, okay, and they are generally Canadian, if not Canadian born, at least active in Montreal or in the region of Ottawa, Ontario and Quebec. But of course, most of the paintings that were there were by artists from other countries that were lent, that were on works of art that had been lent by the patrons. And it's a long process figuring this out. And so I really only did the oil paintings for 1870. If I was going to work on it a lot more, I would do a few more samples because you have to try and, with internet today, I was able to find an incredibly high percentage of them. I think about over 80% of the artists I was able to identify where they came from, when they were born, and so on. And if we look at the artists by country in 1870, we see that Great Britain accounted for about 40%. And then DFG, which is, if I remember correctly now, what was it? D was, F was Flemish, Dutch, Flemish, and German that I put together, 21%, 18% American, 16% Canadian. And we recognize that we're not talking about native-born Canadians. Most of them weren't native-born, but they were active in Canada. And then 5% who were either French or Italian. The other thing that I looked at with this same population here was the age, because it gives us an idea. Are these works of the Renaissance? Are these works Baroque or whatever? And in fact, almost all of the paintings are contemporary paintings, and really paintings that are done by people of the age of the collectors. So 61% of the paintings that were shown there are done by artists that were between 35 and 55 years old. 23% were older than 55, 11% were under 35, and 5% were deceased. So, and in many cases, they weren't very old. There was just that they had died relatively recently. There were a few copies of Renaissance works that were announced as copies that weren't. Lots of times you hear about stories about, there was a great Corot, was it Francois Corot paintings? He said, where they say Corot did a lot of painting in his life. He did over 5,000 paintings, 10,000 of which exist in the United States. And there was this feeling often that there were copies. Here, there certainly were copies, but they were announced as such. And it was an infinitesimal portion of the paintings that were shown during this period, at least. Okay, I'm going to show some of these paintings. Whoops, can I go backwards here? Some of these paintings later. And I just want to, okay, let me just look again at the other. Okay, this one here. Just go quickly through these exhibitions here. The 1864 exhibition, interestingly enough, the main people that were involved in organizing it were relatively closely connected to the Anglican Church. And we must remember that it was Bishop Fulford was the president of the Art Association at that time. And he had been the one that had kind of called the initial organizing meeting in 1860 when the Prince of Wales was coming, and so on. And a number of the people that were involved at that time were close to that. But by 1865, we're in a completely different world. The bishop stays on until he dies in 1868, but he's more of a figurehead and probably a very useful figurehead in many ways. There are clergy of other confessions, and there are certainly people, collectors and so on, from a wide variety of religious orientations. So 1865, a very interesting exhibition where American dealers were invited to participate, and there were a large number of paintings from the United States, from Boston, and from New York. These were clearly identified that way. There was also a whole section on photography, and it was probably the exhibition that showed the most photography and showed it as an art. And also there were some historical photographs that were artworks in themselves and precious artworks in themselves that dated from earlier. But of course, there were local photographers, including the many excellent photographers that were active in Montreal, Notman and Henderson and so on. There was also a section devoted to etchings and engravings. But the other thing that I found was very interesting, that there was decorative arts. And there were a number of merchants that were, I guess is the word, or artisans that were involved in decorative arts. Glassware, tableware, tables themselves, like furniture and so on. And that was the only time that was really recognized. And then this was immediately cut out after that. But it did involve a number of merchants and so on, smaller merchants than the people that were organizing these things, that could have created a different type of synergy, if you like, than was the case afterwards. 1867 was probably the best organized exhibition of the time. I didn't find a lot of patriotic, we're a country type of thing. I didn't see this. The exhibition itself was held in the spring, so it was before July 1st. There were a few oblique references to the fact that, Canadian painting at a time when Canada, but it was very rare. It was not the most important part. But what we do see is that there was what we don't see in the previous exhibitions, which probably existed to some extent, but is not as visible, is promoting the exhibition ahead of time. And there were complimentary tickets that were given out to the officers of the garrison in Montreal. You remember, probably most of you, that the British troops were still stationed in Montreal until 1870. And the garrisons themselves were a kind of a hive of cultural activity. There was theater there was music, some of the instruments that were not very well known in the rest of Montreal at the time, you would find in there, in the garrison. You'd find also, of course, a number of people that were very equipped, very skilled in drawing. And so there was a sketching club that was made up a lot of military personnel, but not just. It was a social group. There were a number of amateurs, and there were some women involved as well. And they had a special section in the 1867 exhibition that was done by the sketching club. There were tickets sent to the Board of Arts and Manufactures, the Mechanics Institute, the Mercantile Library, to the officers of the Institut Canadien, and to Colonel License, the president of the Sketching Society. And of course, there were free tickets too for all the lenders of the works of art as well, whether they were members or not. Also, what's interesting, I just mentioned this rapidly, that for the copy of the catalog in 1867, we have the prices for a number of the paintings that were for sale. And this question of the selling of the works of art is an interesting one. This is there in a couple of the catalogs. I can't remember quite now which ones. It's marked with an asterisk. The ones that the works of art that have an asterisk next to them in the catalog are for sale. In this particular case, you can see in the 1867, you can see written by hand the prices, the asking price for a number of these things that range between about $10 to about maybe $200, something like that. 1868 exhibition, a big drop from compared to 1867. And it had been decided at that time to exclude photography. In fact, photography won't be included again as an art section. There will be certain prizes that'll be given that'll be photographs. But there were 1868, there were a lot of complimentary tickets that were sent out. I'm mentioning this because the 1868 exhibition is a very important one in terms of the dynamics of what was going on. It was the least successful exhibition. It only lasted 5 days. There was the opening night ceremony. They called them the conversazioni. 230 people came. There was music and so on. And 1,000 people. This is one of the cases where we have a relatively a figure on the number of people that came. They said 1,000 people came in the 5 days. 1870, there was a notable exhibition. There was the presence of Prince Arthur, and that always stimulated participation in these events. The British connection was always very treasured in this particular milieu. And but there was a controversy about artistic prizes, and this was new. There had been no artistic prizes before. When you're a loan exhibition, who are you going to give the prize to? Are you going to give it to the person that lent it to you, or the person that the artist, and so on? So, but now some things are changing, and there was a huge controversy about prizes. And then the 1872 exhibition was there was a huge controversy there. Because where we can see now it's the artists that have really kind of taken control of the exhibition. This is a joint exhibition by a newly formed association called the Canadian Society of Artists, together with the other organization, the Art Association of Montreal. And it results in a huge controversy where a number of artists complain that this is really under the within a little clique that is there. So anyway, I just want to go through that quick overview of the different exhibitions. Here we can look at some of the paintings. You know, I feel a little embarrassed about this. I'm not trying to comment on them in terms of the artistic the paintings themselves. It's more to get different types of genre that were shown. There was a number of there were a number of landscapes, I think was a major one, and genre painting that would tell little stories, if you like, were the two most popular. There was very little religious painting, or there were very few portraits also, actually, surprisingly enough. Here's a painting by an American. You see this is lent by George Drummond. At one point, I maybe got off on a track. George Drummond seemed to be one type of actor at the Art Association, and another fellow that I got very interested in was Frothingham. The people from Westmount that are listening in probably know of the Frothingham family. Louisa Frothingham was a very important community activist and in women's roles, and the father, John Frothingham, was an important merchant and left a bequest to McGill for the chair in moral philosophy and so on. And so it was a very active family connected to the Unitarian Church. And so I thought, oh, well, I'm interested in comparing a little bit if Drummond and George Frothingham, am I saying that right? Had different types of tastes in what they were buying and what they were showing. And I must admit, I couldn't push this very far. I would have taken up too much time, but I couldn't see huge differences really, even though they had completely different interests in why the way the Art Association was working. They basically bought the same types of paintings, and from the same, they both bought Canadian, they both bought French, they both bought Dutch, and so on. So I couldn't find any major differences. Maybe a more skilled art historian would be able to. Here, another painting. This is a painting by what we would consider a Canadian painter, even though he was from Germany. This was one of the preferred artists of Drummond, Jacobi, and he was an important artist at the time. Here, Frothingham. Here's an American painting from Frothingham. A very striking painting, 1860. So this is, of course, you realize these are not the paintings that were on view at the exhibitions. That would have been lovely if I'd been able to find that. But a lot of these painters painted by series. They did a number of paintings that were along the same lines, the same themes and everything like that. And so I figured if I could find a painting from the same period by the same painter, that it would give us a rough idea of what was there. Some of those other ones, this is also lent by Frothingham, British painter, even though it's in Italy. And here's another one, Frothingham. This was the time when Rosa Bonheur was a very famous artist in France, and the scenes of cattle and so on, where it was a very popular theme at the time. Here's this is the kind of the genre music, where we have the King's cavalry moving into position, a reference to a particular battle during the Civil War, the 17th century Civil War in Britain. So we're more interested in the action than in reproducing anything of the 17th century painting. It's a very 19th century painting of a 17th century situation. Here's another of the type of genre scenes that we would be seeing. This is by this WFK. He inherited money. He was born in Canada, born in Montreal, I believe, but he retired to the Saint-Jean-sur-the-Richelieu region and lived there for a number of years. His son was an MP, a Liberal MP in Ottawa after this period. Here's some of the painters that submitted their own works. Alan Edson, which we know, lumberjacks on the St. Maurice River, a very different image of some lumberjacks than we would have imagined seeing them today. They're not rolling on those logs that we see. And John Arthur Fraser, a September afternoon in the Eastern Township. So these would be some of the types of paintings that we'd see at the time. So let's turn to some of the players. Now, I don't expect you to look and remember these names, but I just thought I'd flash them up on the screen in case there were people that there are some people that are very difficult to find much on. People know Peter Redpath, but there's no real. I haven't been able to find any really good biography, not even in the dictionary of Canadian biography. George Drummond, of course, is relative known. Here was this William Kay that I mentioned earlier, and there are others. Thomas Sterry Hunt is perhaps pretty well known as well. He was a chemist. He was a real exception, a chemist interested in geology and so on. He went off to become a chemist at MIT afterwards, but he was a very kind of important figure at the time. I know a little bit about some of the others, but I won't go into that right now. Whoops, I don't want to look at this right yet. So in fact, what I'll do is I'll stop the sharing. I won't be For the rest, I won't be showing many slides. There's just one slide that I want to show at the very end. So you see, you saw this list of the core members of the council. So now we're going to look at the different players. We've looked at what the exhibitions are. Now we're going to look at the different players. And in particular, we're going to look at the core group that was involved in the Art Association itself. And basically, what I did to identify this group is I went through the minutes of the meetings and decided who was there the most and who sat on the committees and who were involved in making the motions and everything like that. And these were the 9 people that came through, you know, really very clearly as people that were at all of the meetings, doing committee work and so on, and being involved in the active affairs of the association. If we just talk about them generally, most of them were merchants. There were a few, like John Popham was a lawyer, and Frederick Matthews, FB Matthews, was mainly a treasurer and involved in finance, an investor to some extent as well. But other than that, they're basically merchants. And, you know, that's a very interesting thing. From what I could understand, this is really something that was unique in Montreal, the overwhelming presence of merchants, as opposed, there were basically no intellectual figures, even like somebody like Thomas Sterry Hunt. He was not a literary figure, he's not a philosopher. He was certainly very competent in his area for the day, but I wouldn't call him a kind of a literary or an intellectual figure. There are no artists. That's interesting to note. Okay, so that there are not artists that are part of the core group on the council, and in fact, there are no artists that sit on council until the very end. There, 1869 is the first year that the artists suddenly gained the right to sit on council. Another thing that exploring, there are no bankers. There are no really rich people. Later on, when we get into the 80s and 90s and everything like that, a lot of the people on council are associated one way or another with the Bank of Montreal. But at this period, this is not the case. And that there are a number of, you know, Hugh Allen, George Haig, Sir John Rose, A.T. Galt, Francis Hinks. These are all kind of major figures, kind of what are they called? You know, movers, shakers, and movers type of thing in the life that they're not associated with the Art Association whatsoever at this time, and yet they are of this generation. And that's the other thing that I forgot to mention about this group, is that they're basically all born in the 1820s. There is one that was born in 1819, and then there's this Frederick Kay that is born 20 years after the others in the 1840s. But otherwise, they're all within a few years born in the 1820s. So when we look at them in terms of a generation, these were all people, you know, if they're born in the 20s, they're coming into their own in the 1840s, 50s, and so on, emerging as more public figures in the 50s. So this is after the rebellions, even after, say, the annexation movement. But it is a period which in many ways is the heyday of English Montreal. It's a time when Anglophones constitute the majority of the population in Montreal. And so it's people of this generation. When we look in terms of the national origins of these people, only 3 of them are born in Canada, 3 of them born in Quebec, as a matter of fact, and in Montreal also. Peter Redpath, George Frothingham, and this WFK, Frederick Kay, were also born in Canada. In all 3 cases, it was their fathers that made the fortune. And so that's interesting. These are not the rough diamonds that are looking to get polished and everything like that. These are people that were born into families that were relatively well off. Others, amongst the others, we know came from more modest backgrounds, and but this was not the case of the Canadians. There were 5 Brits, 3 English, and 2 Scots, and there was 1 American. That was that Hunt, the geologist and chemist, was an American from Connecticut, who was incidentally married into a very prestigious family in Montreal, the Gates. He married the daughter of Samuel Gates. Okay, let's look at the lenders now. Of course, a lot of the most prominent members of council were also among the most prominent lenders, but there were lenders that very important lenders that didn't get involved in the Art Association at all. They were members, of course, but they didn't get involved in the board or in the council. And inversely, or conversely, or whatever, there were members of the council that were not did not show a lot of their works. We don't know how big how big their collection was, but they didn't show very much, including Peter Redpath himself. He showed very little, and there were others that didn't show that much. Altogether, there are about 200 distinct patrons during this period. 200 different people. That's including all types, painters, dealers, and what I call the patrons. There were about 200. If we look at just the patrons, there were 126 that contributed at least 1 work of art during the 6 exhibitions, and 121 of them were men. But there were 5 women that did lend art to these exhibitions, and one of them was the wife of George Frothingham, and his daughter. His daughters also would be important collectors later on. It's just one last thing. Amongst the patrons, 19 of them loaned 10 or more works during this period, but almost half of them only lent 1 or 2 works during that period. Okay, let's look quickly now at the artists as players. We talked about the artists in terms of the works that were there, but now we're talking about artists as they got involved in the affairs of the association. So I mentioned they weren't part of council until 1869. At that time, C. Charles Jones Way, who became president of this new association called the Society of Canadian Artists, he came onto council. And this Jacoby, we saw one of the paintings by Jacoby that belonged to Drummond. He also came to sit on council. But strictly speaking, the artists are there in the loan exhibitions. They're loaning their own works. There were 59 different painters that participated, 59 painters that lent their works to these exhibitions, 3 sculptors. There was more sculpture that was there, but it was lent by the patrons. 3 sculptors showed some of their own works. And 14% of the painters were women. So there were some women, and I haven't tried to develop on this. I think, it's something else that I want to develop if I do continue this history late after the period when the Art Association moves into its premises on Phillips Square, and their women painters will become a more important part of the exhibitions. And it's something I'd like to look into more at that time. But there were 14% of the painters that were women. Dealers, I think I'll just dealers. It should be studied more. I don't have a lot to say about it, but I know that they did provide practical services for the AAM. They knew a lot of the collectors. They knew who people could be approached to loan some of their works. When they had, they weren't none of them were specialized art dealers, and most of them had some other type of thing that they were selling, whether it was prints or whether it was bookbinding or paper products or frames or mirrors and windows and so on. But they would use their place which would be frequented by a number of people interested in the arts. And so tickets were available for the exhibitions at their place and so on. Community leaders, it's fair to say that there was no one community leader who took the issue of the Art Association to heart. I think probably the closest to that was Bishop Fulford, but at least from what I could see, it was not something that he pushed a lot, that he had a particular interest in art. I think that he felt that it was an important part of the culture of society, but that's all. Peter Redpath, I think what I'd put that, he was more of an operator than somebody that was really interested in art. In fact, when he will found a museum, we know of the Peter Redpath Museum at McGill. It has nothing to do with art at all. And it was founded, a little bit after this period that I'm talking about here. And we don't see any real evidence that Peter Redpath was that interested in art itself. Okay, let's look at the dynamics. How are we doing for time now? Okay, we may go over a little bit here. The dynamic, maybe I'll try and skip some of these things here, but here what I'm interested in is how did the different groups work together, and what kind of tensions existed between them, and what kind of obstacles had to be overcome. And actually, it's a lot easier to understand the dynamics when you start looking at what actually happened when there were problems. And one of the biggest problems was what I call the 6-year drought. After the 1872 spring exhibition, there'll be no more exhibitions until 1878. And not only will there not be any more exhibitions, but basically the operations of the Art Association fall into disuse. There are no general meetings. There are very few council meetings, and it basically goes into hibernation for about 6 years. And so you figure something happened. And the common answer to that is the economic depression. And that at that time, people just, they didn't have the money to be buying new works of art. You couldn't show the same works of art all the time and so on. And so, but it's a very convenient type of 1873. Dennis Reed wrote on it, and I'll quote, it's very eloquent. There was no exhibition. This was after the last exhibition, 1872. There was no exhibition the following spring. And then in September 1873, the remarkable economic boom of the early 70s ended in an equally remarkable and devastating crash. Wall Street collapsed, banks and railroads failed all over the United States, and the economic depression set in. By the late fall, the effects were strongly felt in Canada, particularly in Montreal. Both the AAM, the Art Association, and the SCA, the Society of Canadian Artists, ceased to function. There's no doubt that there was an economic depression during this time, but I'm not convinced by this argument. At the very time that the art exhibitions were suspended in Montreal, the Ontario Artist Society is founded, and they start holding regular art exhibitions. In the United States, both in Boston, it's a period when they moved into more luxurious premises, and the art exhibitions continue unabated. The Society of American Artists is founded in 1872 and starts holding annual exhibitions and so on. So this kind of automatic connection between economic depression and inability to hold exhibitions just doesn't seem to quite hold for me. I think that we can understand it better. In other words, instead of going to an external factor, let's look at an internal factors that were going on. We see in the 1868 exhibition that there are problems. We noticed that it's the lowest, it's the smallest exhibition to be held to date. They had trouble finding somebody to speak at the exhibition. Usually they would try and find some person, either an expert on art in general. Usually they were clergymen that had some knowledge of the fine arts that would give a very edifying speech on the arts. Sometimes it was other people. But they did, at this time, they couldn't find anybody who could really give an address. And in fact, they didn't have an address. What they did was at the end of the evening, to the people, the most loyal members that had stayed till the end of the evening, Peter Redpath got up and he said, "Look, we're in trouble. There are a lot of problems." And it wasn't a very motivating speech for the people that had stayed on. He says, we only have 180 members now. We had 300 last year. Only 230 people have come to the conversazioni, the little opening night ceremonies. Last year we were up at 425. We had just over 1,000 people that came to the exhibition this year, but last year we had 2,500. And he says, in fact, according to the financial report, the early indication of the financial report, there are only 100 non-members that came to the exhibition. And so, of course, members were let in free, and they gave out a lot of free tickets and so on. But they'd only really attracted 100 people that paid to get in. So they decided on the spot to hold a special meeting to decide what they were going to do about the situation. And they asked this Charles Dewey Day, he's another example, I would say, of a community leader, prestigious lawyer or judge now, and Chancellor of McGill from 1864 to 1884. He was to chair this meeting. It was to be held the following Saturday, that is in like 4 days' time. And so it was. So this meeting is a very interesting meeting. There are newspaper accounts of the meeting, and newspapers say, though not large, the attendance was highly influential. In fact, with all the names that they give, they don't give necessarily everybody's name, but they probably gave the most prestigious names. It was essentially the same core group who attended the meetings of the Art Association in general. Redpath was there, Drummond was there. Of course, Bishop Fulford wasn't there, but there were a few clerics from the Anglican Church that were there. And Judge Day opened the meeting with a solemn warning. The Art Association is at a crossroads in its history. It is clear that the present state of affairs will not allow the Art Association to achieve the objective of an art gallery and a school of design. It was also clear that there was no serious preparation for this meeting. It was called with 4 days' notice, held on a Saturday morning. The suggestions made were very general, without any previous evaluation of their feasibility. Still, two very different types of solutions to the problems facing the association emerged. One I've called the civic-centered top-down approach, and the other I've called the artist-centered bottoms-up approach. So the civic-centered top-down approach, this was basically the solution presented, or the proposition made by Chancellor Day. He says, look, we've got to get that gallery built. And once we get it built, we've got momentum. We've got a fundraising campaign going on. We've got momentum. We can convince people to make donations and build up the collection. And gradually, as people make bequests and so on to the art gallery, then it'll become a dynamic part of the art world in Montreal. Certainly, Redpath was in favor of that, and made some suggestions. And Drummond was in favor, and so on. Then there was only one other person that really spoke up, but apparently he had an influence that suggested another approach. The civic approach. The fellow was Thomas Rimmer, and very practically unknown. But not, I've been able to trace out some of the things. He had an important investment company in the transport business. He was an importer mainly, and And he was president of the Board of Trade at the time of this meeting. He'd been vice president before, president of the Board of Trade afterwards. And his brother was actually a very good example of a literary figure, you know, more interested in literary pursuits, artistic pursuits. His brother did loan paintings that he himself had done. He was interested in writing poetry and novels and so on. This brother who was a little younger than Thomas River, but Rimmer himself, he was not literary. At least we see no evidence of any literary interests at all. But he did have this, I would say, artist-centered approach. He criticized the approach of Day and Drummond and Redpath, saying, you know, you'll spend a fortune building an art gallery, and the collection you'll have in there will just be mediocre. It'll be small and mediocre. People will come once and they'll never come back. And he said, no, on the contrary, what you have to do is support Canadian art, support Canadian painters, get more and more people interested in this, and gradually build up interest. And then we'll be able to tackle more ambitious projects. He doesn't really say the advice he gives is artists should look after their own interests. You won't be served by anybody better than yourselves. Found an association to defend your interests, and the Art Association will help you. That's basically his point of view. And then the discussion goes off in all directions and everything like that. Finally, somebody has the bright idea of saying, well, listen, we should found a committee to look into all of this. Everybody says, hey, good idea. And they adjourn the meeting. They do form a committee, but the committee never meets, of course. And we can see that it's a can of worms. And it just basically stops there, except that the suggestions of Rimmer are basically adopted, more by default, in the sense that there's nobody that's trying to organize a fundraising campaign to get the art gallery launched. And so basically all that's left is the Rimmer proposal. And the artists do found their society, and that's where the Society of Canadian Artists is founded. And the Art Association cooperates with them. They can use their premises, they use their infrastructure that the Art Association has built up, and they allow artists now to sit on council. And so let's see, basically, just to cut it short, what happens is that the spring exhibition of 1870, the artists say, well, listen, you know, if you really want to get artists interested in everything like that, you should be offering prizes. And so we should give a prize. The Art Association will buy the best painting for $200. It'll go into the permanent collection of the Art Association, and we'll make chromolithographs of it and distribute it to our members and so on. But as soon as you start offering prizes, you're into a whole different ballgame, because then you've got juries, then you've got who's on the jury and how are they being judged and everything like that. And this immediately creates a huge kerfuffle between the artists. The artists that are on council and the ones close to them don't want to be excluded from the prizes. And in fact, it is a member of council that will be awarded the prize as the best painting. And so there are so many artists that say, well, this is just all arranged ahead of time. It's a farce and so on. And eventually the artist that does win the prize accepts to share the prize with the runner-up and so on as a gesture of magnanimity. But the reputation of the Art Association is really changed. And if I can just show one, I just came across this by accident. I can hardly believe it myself. I must have done we used some good keyword. But in a small little magazine in Montreal, we see some reflection of this controversy, where it says, it's in a little magazine that's called Diogenes. I don't know if anybody has ever heard of it before. They're actually all the issues that only lasted for about 3 years, and all the issues are on the web. And I haven't had time to comb it through to really understand it better. But there is this cartoon where you see the Fine Arts Board of Relief, and you see these painters that are hitting each other over the head with their paintings. And it says, victors and vanquished, or a race for $200, respectfully dedicated to the Montreal Fine Arts Association. So at least it got that type of a reaction in the public. This is from the spring of 1870. Basically the situation worsened. The group that was most closely connected to the Art Association that was running it basically flooded the exhibition with their own works. And so, for example, C.J. Way, the president of the association, he showed 18 of his paintings. Daniel Fowler showed 17. Jacoby showed 9. Henry Sandham showed 16, and so on. So, and they kept the best positions for themselves. And even the lenders, it was supposed to be a joint association with the Art Association, but even the lenders of European art were kind of shunted off or skied. And so in a sense, the artists had kind of hijacked the Art Association. That's maybe a little bit of a harsh, it's maybe not quite that black and white, but it's certainly the tendency was there. So in short, I would say that even if there hadn't been an economic downturn, the state of affairs at the Art Association was in a shambles. Practically all of the efforts of the members of council were mobilized to support the exhibition of a group of Canadian painters. The internal rivalries were dragging down not only the Canadian Society of Artists, but the Art Association itself. And I don't want to, it's a little sad to finish up on a defeat. And so what I'd say is, above and beyond the question of this 6-year drought, I think it would be mistaken to evaluate this initial period of the Art Association solely in function of its temporary demise. If we step back a bit, we can see that this 8-year experiment from 1864 to 72 made an important contribution to the shaping of a public space for the arts in Montreal. It was the first example of support for the arts by a civic institution. And of course, there were theaters that were constructed and so on, but not systematically, not with theater troupes, for example, or not with an orchestra or something like that. Here was an institution that was devoted to developing the fine arts in Montreal. And this is what I mean by becoming modern. As long as the careers of artists remain largely a matter of private transactions, the social conditions for the development of modern art couldn't exist. Modern art is founded on the existence of a public space where artistic conventions are contested and debated. The Art Association contributed to the construction of that space. And in that sense, I see its action very much part of the process of becoming modern. I should just say, okay, brought over 1,400 works of art, patrons, local artists, and so on. There are a lot of things I couldn't cover in this talk. What hurt the most to cut out was the public. I just talked very briefly about the number of people for a few exhibitions. There were some letters to the press. There were reviews. There were reviews in the French press as well, and it's something I haven't talked about. There were very few French artists at this time that submitted works, but the French press, the Minerve, encouraged French artists to participate. If we can talk a little bit about that if there are questions. But I would say the other things that I feel that I would like to develop more anyway, the need to better understand the dynamics between civic interests, the way this was working in other localities, in other cities, this balance between artists' interests and civic interests. I think all of these, a lot of the galleries that are being created at this time are city oriented, from Boston, from Buffalo, from Cincinnati, and so on. And so to look at that would be very interesting. And to better understanding what was going on in English Canada as a whole. And my feeling is that this was the period when the kind of the hub of the cultural hub, if you like, of English Canada was moving westward, was moving into Ontario. That's where we see the publishing houses. That's where we see the what I was thinking. When the publishing was oh yes, some of the magazines, national magazines that are coming out, and that's something that the commentary on this was as much from. There's a lot of that's going on at this time where the commentary is from Ontario rather from Montreal. There's no figure, no intellectual figure that is talking about this. Anyway, that's as far as I can go today. Thank you very, very much. And I hope that I haven't taken out all the time, that there will still be some time for questions.
Not at all, Lorne. You don't have to feel bad about going over one bit. In fact, I see that there are still a lot of people in the call, and I'm sure many of them would like to ask you questions. Thank you for that presentation. And I'll just begin by asking probably a dumb question from the start, but I'm not sure if I heard you mention where the very early exhibits of the ones that you were describing today actually took place. And this was before their gallery was built. Where were they? So where did these exhibits actually, where were they put on?
Yeah, that is an interesting question. The first ones, the 1860 was a little bit different. There was one there was a kind of a pre-exhibition before the Prince arrived. They did a kind of a dress rehearsal that was held in a theater, Nordheimer's Hall. The one when the Prince was there was held at the Crystal Palace, and then it was at the Mechanics Hall in 1864, 1865, 1866 on St. James Street. And then in 1867, the Mercantile Library opened up a new building, and there they had a floor that they had where they had space for a gallery, and they had an office there and so on. And so there they stayed there 67, 68, 70, and 72. But what's really interesting is at that, even though the Mercantile Library had been built only in 1867, by 1872, they were saying, nobody's coming here anymore. Everything has moved uptown. This is the talk that Rod McLeod gave a little while ago, the importance of that move. And the Mercantile Library basically went into inactivity roughly about the same time as the Art Association, and they were located near Victoria Square. That was where their place was.
Thank you. I wonder also, just following on your remarks at the very end of the presentation about not having time to talk about the public. Well, here's some time to talk about the public. You mentioned, I think, that in 1869 or thereabouts, perhaps in 1868, the actual viewership or attendance at these exhibits had fallen to just 100 people.
No,
that would change.
There were 1,000 people there, but only 100
paying customers
for a ticket.
Okay, yeah. Okay, yeah. Sorry, I misspoke, but still lower than they had anticipated, I guess. Yeah. How did that change, and did the public change as the artists and shall I say the lenders and the organizers of the exhibit came to terms with a different strategy for obtaining their goals?
Well, I haven't really done detailed studies of how it evolved after that. I did a detailed study of a very interesting art exhibition that was held at the new premises of the Art Association. This was the ones that were created after the building on Phillips Square when they moved up to Sherbrooke Street. And in 1913, they had a very interesting exhibition that was quite controversial. There we could talk about modern art or beginnings of modern art and so on, that was held there. And there, the number of people that attended, some people said that there were 25,000. It was probably closer to about 15,000 people. But it got, it got prominent coverage, and I think I went systematically through all of the coverage, and I think there were 50 different articles on the art exhibition, including on the front page of the Montreal Star when it started off, and went on the opening night. And so, I mean, these were really sought after, or let's say, had an influence in the art world at the time.
What would you say was the most common motivation for the lenders to participate in these exhibits and to be involved in their planning as members of the council?
Well, like I say, I think there was some that was kind of trying to build their own personal reputation, but some of them, like I say, were more interested for industrial reasons, that you could be training people in making people better artists, and for drawing mechanical things, for design of improving the design of projects and everything like that. So there was a kind of an industrial art interest in the Art Association. But I think that there were others that were very interested for Canadian art, to develop Canadian art. And there were others that were very interested to become involved in, establishing Montreal's reputation against other cities. And, I think that there was a real competition between cities at this time, starting to get their own orchestra, to get their own opera, to get their own cultural institutions. And so there were people there that maybe were not art fanatics, but they were interested in promoting Montreal at that time.
Rod McLeod has raised his hand, and he would like to ask a question. Rod?
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Lauren. Great stuff. I'm so glad you're doing all this work. I mean, I was looking into this a little bit, as you were saying a while back, and I was struck by, nobody's looked at this until just recently. And I think your work is really, pioneering in relatively speaking, because people get caught up in just all the politics of the 20th century with institutions like this. But I was intrigued with this whole idea of the 6-year drought and all that. And I'm just trying to remember reading about Robert Mackay, who I think became the president at the time that they opened a new building on Phillips Square. And he got involved, prominent Montreal lawyer. He got involved late in the game. And I think early in the 70s, so just a few years earlier, when the Fraser Library was taking shape, or not taking shape, but the money had been left, and there was, one of those endless debates that went on for about 15 years about whether we will be able to pull the resources together, kind of a parallel story. But he said something about like, oh, I'm going to, when I die, I'm going to donate all my collection to the Fraser Institute library, which seems like a very odd thing to do, given that there is an art association with an annual show, even if it's starting to run into some serious problems. But I wonder if that's an indication of, maybe it's just a political division. Obviously, Mackay came around at the end, or whether it's an indication of the lack of confidence for whatever reason that maybe you know more about. Sort of a general lack of confidence. I know that the Fraser left some money to have an art gallery as part of the library, which is also a strange thing. But for Mackay to sort of jump on that seems a bit odd. But maybe it's an indication of something. I don't know.
Yeah, very interesting. I know what is interesting is that the rebirth of the association is really precipitated by the death of somebody who is Benaiah Gibb, right? And he is, and this was known, generally speaking, that everybody there are a number of the comments, oh, Benias Gibb donated one painting to the art exhibition this year. He's got loads of them. What's holding him back from making more of a presentation and so on? And he does do a few, but he's not. He's a little bit active at the very beginning in 1860, but then he'll send a painting from time to time, but he's not involved in the. But when he dies, he leaves his huge part of his collection, some of it saying, please, I want somebody to go through this and sort out stuff that isn't worth putting in a museum. And but he does have a number of paintings that he certainly feels are worthy of a museum. And he leaves the money, a good down payment on the money to build a museum, and a certain amount of money to contribute to operating costs for a museum. And he wants it built on Phillips Square. And then what you see is the community leaders come, and Judge Mackay comes, Francis Hinks comes. There are all kinds of people that are more operators, I would say, than necessarily. I mean, most of them are rich as well, but these are people that are, say, okay, this is going to make a difference, and they'll get involved. I think you're right that after 1868, nobody's going to be making big bequests to the Art Association for that period, 1868 up until Benaiah Gibbs really his bequest puts it on solid enough grounds. But other than that, I think that nobody's convinced that the Art Association will continue for very long after that.
Thank you, Lorne, for that response. We have two more questions.
One second. I'd say it's a real tribute to Benaiah Gibbs in that sense, that he had that vision and that he had the resources, but that he used his resources to do that, because otherwise it may not have been resuscitated. Sorry.
Maureen Wilson, I think your hand went up first. Please go ahead.
Okay, hi, and thanks, Lorne, for doing this. That was really interesting. I was interested in some of your comments about sort of toward the end of the period you're looking at, where there's a decline in the domination of the merchants in terms of the council, and then a little bit more of women in some evidence. And it occurs to me that, and also the end of that period of economic recession, because right at that time, Princess Louise shows up, the daughter of Queen Victoria, who was an artist herself and was the wife of the Governor General, which is how she got here. But she was known to be a supporter of women's rights, supported votes for women, which her mother did not, home rule for Ireland, and she made friends with Indigenous people while she was in Ottawa. And apparently she much preferred Montreal to Ottawa, spoke excellent French, and hung out in Montreal quite a bit. And the connection with Indigenous people is interesting because the Riel Rebellion happens not long after this. She's back in England by that time, but she sends a lot of material aid to the Riel side of that rebellion, which is, a whole other interesting story. But I'm wondering, she and her husband were both big supporters of the arts, and I think he was an artist as well. And so I'm wondering, what influence that you think their presence, which seemed to be quite a large presence, might have had in some of these shifts that were happening?
I think it was fundamental, actually. There were two things that really changed, moved things completely at that time. The first was the bequest, where they got the money together and they founded. But when the Marquess of Lorne, whom I always have a slight sympathy for, and Louise, Princess Louise, came, one of the first things that they got involved in was founding an academy, and the academy, the Royal Academy of Arts, the Royal Canadian Academy of the Arts. And that also has a huge impact, because once once you start naming people who are going to be the Academy, that's also a tremendous marketing tool. You know, people don't know that much about art. I want some art. I want good art. Here's the art that has been chosen by other artists as being good art, and so on. And that plays a very, very important role. And that is certainly something that I would like to examine more in another talk. And I think that you're completely right too, that somebody like Princess Louise really did encourage women to. They were doing painting even before this, you know, before the 1880s, and but they weren't submitting them. It was considered just part of the way that a cultured woman would pass some of her time. And there were a few women British painters that came towards the end of the time. The wife of the director of Hudson Bay in Montreal was a very accomplished painter, and she went out, you know, she accompanied her husband on these trips up the rivers and into the Hudson Bay territories and everything like that, and did a huge number of paintings on Indigenous life at that time, became very famous for those paintings. But she went back to England and did paintings of Native peoples in Canada for the rest of her life. And but you know, so I think that women like her were also an example. And so this was certainly a thing. When I can find I think that you can see the start of women's interest in participating in the public sphere of painting, but it's still relatively marginal, but it'll really pick up in the 80s. And the public sphere on art in general will really pick up in the 80s.
Right. And not just painting, because she was a sculptor.
A sculptor, you're right.
Really not an acceptable thing for women artists to be doing.
It's true.
Time. Yeah.
Thank you, Maureen, and thank you, Lorne. And you've both helped, for me, connect the Art Association of Montreal's early founders with the future education piece around art so well. We have a question also now from Suzanne Loftus. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Suzanne, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks so much, Lorne, for this work on this crucial period in art. I'm looking forward to looking at this again on the recording, which I appreciate. Just two questions. I may have misunderstood, but the first one is, you mentioned there was quite a representation of landscape art. And I'm just interested in, the second point also, that it was interesting that it was merchant driven and by a wide spectrum of people who were interested in the progress of Montreal in general. So I'm interested that were there some notable artists in terms of representation from Canada and Quebec who were added later, and were wealthy patrons added after this time?
Yeah, I would say that once we get into the second phase, and we have this initial phase that, you know, kind of comes to an end in 1872, and it starts up again around 1877, and blossoms from then until about the 1940s. And it's only really after the war that it becomes, you know, a little bit completely outdated, I would say. But in that period there, from say 1880 to 1940, I think the spring exhibitions and the Art Association itself play an important role in the kind of the public sphere of art in Montreal. So I don't know if that gets exactly to the question. Do you want to?
Thank you.
Something?
Thank you. I'm sure it evolved, but thank you so much. Very interesting. Take care.
Okay.
I think we're going to have to leave it there now. Lorne, again, thank you for a wonderful, informative talk. I'll put a little plug out for Quebec Heritage News because Rod McLeod, as you know, is our editor. And if you are interested in publishing this piece, even in a smaller or shorter form, we would love to have that in Quebec Artist News. I'll leave you to discuss that with Rod, but there's a lot of information here to unpack, and I encourage you to keep going with it. Much appreciated, everybody, for joining us today and supporting the Heritage Online series. I will just give a shout out to Sandra Stock and Doreen Lindsay. They're both former and current board members at Quan, and they're joining us today. Always great to see you both here in the meetings. Next week is our last lecture in the series, and we're actually going to do it in Montreal at the Webster Library. That's Concordia's McConnell Pavilion. The topic is Betty Riley. Betty Riley was a community activist in the Black community in the late 60s and early 70s. And the talk is being given by Desiree Rochat, who is a historian and researcher at Concordia. It's online as well. It's our first attempt to do a hybrid presentation. But you can find the whole program on our website at www.qahn.org. Thanks for listening. Stay curious and take care. Bye.
Thanks, Dwayne.